I'd like to welcome our very own Dr. Heather Cooke. Heather joined the Society in April of 2022 as a Manager of Research and Knowledge Mobilization. Heather has a master's degree in gerontology from Simon Fraser University and a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from the University of Victoria. Having worked in the field of dementia care in both frontline and research capacity for almost 30 years, she is passionate about improving the lives of people living with dementia and their care partners. So, welcome to today's Research Connects webinar. And Heather, take it away.
Thanks so much for that intro, Sarah. And I just want to make sure everyone can see that. Can you see the slides? Thumbs up. Perfect. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Wanted to start with kind of a focus of what you should be able to do by the time we've wrapped up today's session around lecanemab, which is one of the disease-modifying therapies that's under consideration here in Canada to help treat and potentially delay the progression of Alzheimer's disease. So by the end of today's session, you'll be able to describe what lecanemab is and how it works in the brain to slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease. You'll be able to recognize lecanemab's benefits, such as its impact on cognitive decline, while also acknowledging that there are some potential side effects, some risks, and eligibility criteria that accompany it. And also, you'll be able to identify the system access challenges that we're potentially anticipating with lecanemab's use here in British Columbia and actually across Canada as well. So, lecanemab is a monoclonal antibody treatment. And what that means is that it's a laboratory made protein that's designed to mimic the natural immune system antibodies. So each monoclonal antibody is specifically engineered to bind to a specific target molecule. And in this case, it's the aggregates of beta amyloid that accumulate in the brains of people who live with Alzheimer's disease. And so lecanemab is developed and marketed by two drug companies. It was a joint venture, Eisai and Biogen. And unlike the current treatments that focus on managing the symptoms, so medications like donepezil, it's also known as Aricept, or memantine, that temporarily boost memory or cognitive function by addressing disease symptoms, lecanemab addresses the underlying pathology of Alzheimer's by slowing the accumulation of those amyloid plaques and by reducing cognitive decline over time. So lecanemab first appeared on the treatment scene back in late 2022. So it's been a couple of years. And that was when the initial results from a phase 3 clinical trial known as Clarity AD were released. Now, phase 3 trials are designed to confirm a treatment's effectiveness. So they compare the medication to a placebo, to a sugar pill, to assess its safety in a larger population and to identify potential side effects to help assess if the benefits outweigh the risks. And they also confirm the best dosage, the frequency, and the method of administration for the medication. And so a phase 3 trial is typically that final step before seeking regulatory approval for the medication. And in January 2023, the Federal Drug Administration, or the FDA in the US, provided accelerated approval for lecanemab. And this is designed, or this pathway, if you will, is designed to expedite the availability of treatments for serious conditions that address an unmet need. So in May 2023, SI then submitted an application to Health Canada for their approval of lecanemab. And in June 2023, lecanemab received full approval in the US, where it's marketed under the trade name Leqembi and costs about $26,500 per year for treatment, and that's US dollars. So here in Canada, as we'll talk about a little bit later, we're still awaiting Health Canada's decision on whether lecanemab will be approved, and we're unsure when that approval will come, although the latest estimations are probably later this year sometime. So how exactly does this drug work? Well, we often talk when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease about these key hallmarks. So the amyloid plaques, which build up between nerve cells, or neurons as they're called, and the neurofibrillary tau tangles, which build up within the nerve cells. And so lecanemab targets the beta amyloid, which is a key component of the amyloid plaque that's believed to contribute to cognitive decline. And so lecanemab facilitates the immune system to remove that pathological form, that damaging form of beta amyloid from the brain. And so lecanemab is administered intravenously in a healthcare setting for about 1 hour. It takes for it to run through. And someone would have that every 2 weeks for a period of 18 months. So how did it actually perform in those phase 3 trials? Well, there was a 27% overall reduction in cognitive decline for the treatment group compared to the placebo group. So that was the group that was on the sugar pill, or in this instance, they would have still had an IV intravenous administration of a medication, but it would have just been a saline solution that was injected within them. And so what the placebo group experienced decline at about 13 months, the experimental group didn't experience that same level of decline until 18 months. So we can say that the drug appears to delay that progression of symptoms or delay that decline by about 5 months. Now, what's interesting is that when you separate the data out by sex, the results look a little bit different. So there was a 43% reduction in that progression and disease progression in people who were assigned male at birth, but only a 12% reduction in people assigned female at birth. And so a 12% reduction really only translates to a 2-month delay. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, there's some significant side effects that have the potential to accompany the administration of this drug. So it's weighing that out, with a 2-month delay. So these are the things we need to be thinking about. Now, this stat, that 43% and the 12%, that often gets overlooked in favor of the 27% figure, which is the one that's typically most often mentioned. And that's a bit concerning, both the fact it doesn't get mentioned all that often, but also the fact that it's just 12% for people assigned female at birth. And that's because we know that Alzheimer's disease affects more females around the globe than it does males. Now, like many clinical trial participants, the Clarity AD participants were predominantly white, they were well educated, and they had no comorbidities or other illnesses. And fewer than 25% of the trial participants came from ethno-racial minorities, and none of them were Indigenous. And that is problematic because we want to ensure that trial participants that it's going to the findings are going to apply to the largest group possible, that they're really going to be representative of the larger population. And when we have individuals who only come from a small cohort of individuals who are white, who are well educated and relatively affluent, we don't know how that drug is going to perform in the same way for folks who may be of Asian descent or who are Black or um, um, European, for example. All of those ethno-racial differences potentially might affect how that drug is taken up. Now, of course, we want to make sure that trial participants don't have other illnesses because what we want to know is that the changes that we see are due to the drug in question. But again, what this means is we don't really know how well this drug is going to work in ethnically diverse populations or for older adults who may have other illnesses, for example, like cardiovascular disease. Now, clinical trial researchers are finally starting to talk about how to make clinical trials more representative of the general population. And I think that's an extremely important conversation that continues to need to be had. Now, I did mention that lecanemab does have some potential side effects with it. And so, as lecanemab helps the immune system remove amyloid from the brain, some people may experience an unintended immune response. And this resultant inflammation within the brain can cause increased blood vessel leakiness and could lead to side effects such as localized brain swelling, bleeding in the brain, or both. Now, the good news is that those effects are visible on a brain scan. So, for example, via an MRI. And they're known as amyloid related imaging abnormalities, which is quite a mouthful. So, we shorten that to ARIA. And ARIA E refers to edema or swelling within the brain, while ARIA H refers to hemorrhage or bleeding. Now, the ARIA side effects in the phase 3 trials included brain swelling in just about 13% of study participants and brain bleeds in about 17, just over 17% of participants. So, in other words, 1 in 8 people in the treatment group encountered edema, but 1 in 6 people encountered microhemorrhages. Now, when you break that down by ApoE4 status, however, that risk changes considerably. As you might be asking, I feel like maybe I've heard of ApoE4, maybe I haven't, but what is that? Well, ApoE4 is a gene that influences someone's susceptibility to developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, it doesn't mean that they will develop it, only that their susceptibility for developing it increases. And for those with one copy of the gene from one parent, have an increased risk. But that risk further increases if you have 2 copies of the gene. So if you've got one from each parent. Now, of course, this is a little bit ironic because individuals who are ApoE4 carriers and who might be at increased risk for that susceptibility of developing Alzheimer's disease may be more likely to embrace a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And yet they're also the ones that are at higher risk for some of these ARIA side effects. So when we look at the numbers, while only 1 in 19 people who are non-carriers of the ApoE4 experienced ARIA-E or the edema, the brain swelling, that number jumps to 1 in 9 if you have one copy of the ApoE4 gene, and then 1 in 3 if you have 2 copies. And so similarly, when we look at ARIA-H, which is the brain bleeding or the hemorrhaging, 1 in 8 people who are non-carriers experienced ARIA-H, but that number then jumped up to 1 in 7 if someone had one copy of the gene, and 1 in 3 if someone had 2 copies of the gene. And so it's important to note here that most people who experience ARIA were asymptomatic, meaning that they didn't have any outward signs or symptoms that they had this ARIA. So they didn't have a headache, they didn't experience increased confusion, there was no seizure activity or a stroke. And so what that means is we really do need to have that regular MRI monitoring so that we can, and by we, I mean physicians and healthcare professionals, can monitor those side effects. So now that we know some of the benefits and risks, it's important that we identify who exactly are we talking about in terms of eligibility for this medication. And so this is really best thought of as a funnel. And so at the top of the funnel, you have all of the folks who develop dementia of any cause or of any kind. But we know that this medication isn't just for any individual living with dementia, but rather it's specifically designed for people who live with early Alzheimer's disease. And so they might have mild cognitive impairment or they might have mild dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. Now, individuals must also have this presence of amyloid plaques confirmed either through a PET scan or through their analysis of their cerebral spinal fluid, which is collected via a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. Because, of course, we need to know that if the drug is going to clear amyloid beta from the brain, it needs to be present in the brain in the first place. And so that's why we would do the PET scan or the CSF analysis. Now, recipients of the medication are also going to need to live close enough to a major metropolitan center that has the infrastructure to support the administration of biweekly infusions of the drug. So again, someone who lives in rural British Columbia, in the northern parts of the province, or even the interior parts of the province where I live here in the Okanagan, they might be much less likely to be able to access that medication than someone who is living in Vancouver and is able to access a clinic at UBC, as an example. Now, as an aside here, SI has actually submitted another application to the US FDA for lecanemab to be delivered subcutaneously, which would allow for people to have lecanemab injected at home on a weekly basis. And of course, that would greatly expand who'd be able to access the drug from a geographic standpoint. And the FDA is expected to release their decision on the subcutaneous delivery of lecanemab sometime later this summer. So this leaves a relatively small pool of individuals who would be eligible for this treatment. And in fact, drawing on 2020 numbers, the Canadian Drug Agency has estimated that there would probably be around 22,000 people who would have been eligible for the drug had the drug been available back in 2020. Now, this number is in part influenced by the under-recognition of dementia. So research has estimated that only about 38% of people who live with dementia actually have a diagnosis of dementia in their medical record. And of course, this number, this 22,500 number, will also be influenced by people who have other illnesses or comorbidities, because again, they may not be eligible for lecanemab. And for example, a 2024 study looked at the administrative data, so like the equivalent of our MSP data in Alberta, and found that at least 50% of people living with dementia would actually be considered ineligible based on their other illnesses before you even got to a consideration of whether they actually had beta amyloid in the brain. And we currently know very little about the preferences of people who live with dementia or their care partners for treatment with lecanemab. And so here at the Alzheimer Society of B.C, we've conducted a series of focus groups exploring the perspectives of people affected by dementia. And we'll have those study findings ready for sharing sometime in the summer. So stay tuned for the release of those results. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are a number of system access issues that are going to need to be addressed in order to accommodate lecanemab's use here in British Columbia, or for that matter, in Canada. And so we know that in all provinces, primary care doctors have the primary responsibility for diagnosing and managing patients who live with dementia. And we reserve the specialist referrals for more complex cases of dementia. And so, given that, primary care doctors are expected to play a real critical role in identifying potential candidates for lecanemab and helping their patients understand the potential benefits and the risks that may be associated with that treatment. But not only do we have a shortage of primary care doctors in BC and really across the country, but primary care docs don't all have the time, the knowledge, or the training to support a timely and accurate diagnosis of someone who's in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. And so, given the expertise that's required in diagnostic testing and the monitoring of ARIA side effects, lecanemab really needs to be prescribed by a dementia specialist. And so, by that, I mean someone who's a neurologist, who's a geriatrician, or who's a geriatric psychiatrist. But we know there are currently lengthy wait times here in BC for consultation with a specialist. Now, as I've mentioned, to be considered eligible for the drug, you need to have this confirmed presence of beta amyloid. Excuse me. And to do so, you either need that lumbar puncture, the spinal tap that I talked about earlier, that would test, allows for that drawing of the cerebral spinal fluid that can then be tested, or a PET scan. And a PET just stands for a positron emission tomography scan. And that's an imaging test that helps reveal the metabolic or the biochemical functioning of your tissues and your organs, and in this case, your brain. But here in BC, PET scanners are currently unavailable for amyloid detection. They're primarily used in oncology for cancer treatment. And I spoke earlier of the higher risk of ARIA side effects for people who have one or more copies of the ApoE4 allele. And so in the US, the appropriate use guidelines for lecanemab recommend that potential users undergo genetic testing to ensure that they're making an informed decision with their physician about the risks. And so genetic testing is available here in British Columbia, but it can only be ordered by specialists. So again, a neurologist, a geriatrician, or a geriatric psychiatrist. Now, given the potentially serious side effects that I talked about, regular MRIs are required to monitor the presence of ARIA-E or ARIA-H, so either the edema or the hemorrhaging. And computerized tomography, or what we would call a CT scan, which is much easier to get in the queue for, doesn't adequately detect the brain changes that are required for lecanemab to be effective or for those potential ARIA side effects. And in the US, the recommendation is that MRIs occur not only at baseline, but prior to starting the drug so that we know kind of what folks' brains look like prior to starting, and then 3 to 4 times during that first year of treatment. So we can see if there's any ARIA-H or ARIA-E, the swelling or the bleeding that's occurring within the brain. And of course, if you've had to have an MRI for a sporting injury or for any other reason, you'll know that here in British Columbia, getting access to an MRI is not quick. And according to the Canadian Institutes for Health Information, the current wait time for an MRI in BC through the public healthcare system averages between 12 to 18 months. Now, private clinics in BC offer much shorter wait times. They can often schedule a scan within 48 hours, but those come with an out-of-pocket cost of approximately $700 to $900, depending on the type of scan. And we don't know what role private clinics might play in the delivery of potentially a publicly funded drug. So the Canadian Drug Agency has estimated that approximately 7,500 PET scans and almost 71,000 MRIs would be required to support those 22,500 individuals estimated in the previous slide simply within the first year of the treatment. And so after 5 years of lecanemab being on the market, the number of projected annual MRIs simply for lecanemab would be approximately 92,000. Now, the last challenge for which I ran out of room on the slide is around the infrastructure that's required for administering the lecanemab infusions. So these infusions need to occur in either a hospital setting, an outpatient infusion facility, or potentially via a home nursing visit. So again, thinking about the potential approval of lecanemab as a subcutaneous injection. But either way, there are nursing staff that would be needed to support those infusions. So, where in the world is lecanemab currently available? Well, it's been fully approved in the US, Japan, China, South Korea, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, it was also approved in the UK, at least from a safety standpoint. But the National Health Service, also known as the NHS, didn't feel that the benefits outweighed its annual price tag of about 26,500 US dollars. And so in the UK, lecanemab is only available if you have private drug coverage, so through an extended health plan. Now, in the EU, the group that approves new medications initially denied approval, but SI appealed that decision, and that group has since reversed their decision. And so lecanemab is now available to all individuals with the exception of those who carry the ApoE4 gene, again, because of that increased likelihood of risks. Now, at this point, Australia is the only country that has flat out denied the approval of lecanemab. And as I mentioned, here in Canada, we're still waiting. We've been expecting a decision for a while, but again, we're hearing indications that that might not happen until much later this year, or possibly even into the early months of 2026. Now, Health Canada does take into account what's happening elsewhere, but they do have a very thorough review. So we here at the Alzheimer Society of BC have been able to provide input into sort of feedback around the drug, as have other individuals as well. So we just at this point remain waiting and seeing. So when we think about the sort of steps in this Canadian drug approval process, and it's a bit of a black box, as I say, we're simply waiting at this point, but what's happening while we wait? Well, the first step in the drug approval process here in Canada is the Health Canada review. And they review the evidence. So they review all of that research from those phase 3 clinical trials. And if they've got a specific focus on safety, on efficacy, and quality, and they're looking to determine solely whether the benefits outweigh the risks. Now, if Health Canada then approves lecanemab, the next step is the Canadian Drug Agency, and they make a recommendation as to whether drug plans across the provinces and the territories should actually fund the drug. So they then compare the clinical benefits of lecanemab with other drugs that are currently in use. So they'll think about donepezil or Aricept or memantine, which are the drugs we currently have available. And then the next stop is the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And this is comprised of all of the provincial and federal drug plans. And what they do is they engage in these drug access negotiations to determine what should the price be here in Canada. And they, at the end of that, issue what's called a letter of intent, outlining the conditions of reimbursement and what physicians will provide. And so that last step involves the provincial drug plans. We move on from the Pan-Canadian Alliance specifically to the provincial drug plans and folks who decide whether lecanemab should be placed on the formulary in the province. And so on average, it takes 1 year from Health Canada's decision for the CDA to then conduct their review and issue a recommendation. Whoops. There we go. So 12 months. And then it's another 12 months before the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance issues a letter of intent. So again, even if Health Canada approves, by the end of this year, we're still looking at 2027 before something is available via the public drug plan. And of course, there's also the potential that Health Canada does not approve lecanemab for use here in Canada. And so where does that leave folks who live with dementia or live with Alzheimer's disease here in Canada? Now, there's the potential for Canadians to seek treatment abroad. Um, but potentially that also limits access to other innovative therapies and this continued reliance that we have on the non-disease modifying therapies, so the drugs like donepezil or memantine. So really, there are several key takeaways from today's presentation. Like one is that lecanemab marks a significant step forward in Alzheimer's disease treatment, right? Its ability to slow disease progression means it has significant potential for improving someone's quality of life. Given that it's only for individuals who are in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, it highlights the importance of early diagnosis. And it's a bit of a watershed moment in a way, because if it's approved, then we could see other early interventions developed and approved. And I think we're going to see that advocacy really has a role to play here. So given the need for system improvements, the need for increased resources to support early access, um, to early diagnosis and that ongoing MRI monitoring. So we need to really think about how we're going to train healthcare providers to provide that intravenous administration and monitoring for side effects. What training might have to be provided to the radiologists, who are the one who would typically look and evaluate the MRIs that are taken. And again, advocacy is going to be particularly important if the CDA comes back with a recommendation not to fund the drug, because that means that only those with private drug plans would be able to access the drug. And of course, that's not equitable access, which really is something that's a key center part of our Canadian healthcare system, is that equity and equitable access. So really, I think as I wrap up here, is what we're seeing is what neurologist Dr. Alex Henri Bergava, who works out of Victoria, says. He refers to this and the development of lecanemab, and similarly, one of the other anti-amyloid therapies known as donanemab, that these are really base hits rather than a home run. And so I suspect there may be a number of questions today. So I am happy to take any questions.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, Heather. Sarah and I have been accumulating all of these fabulous questions in the chat. Um, so to kick things off, one of our first questions is, could lecanemab be combined with other treatments?
Yes, it could be. And I think that's probably the route that we're going, right? The brain is this incredibly complex organ. We know that, as I mentioned earlier, that we have both the amyloid plaques in the brain, and we also have the tau tangles in our brain. But currently, the only medications that are under review are those that address the amyloid. They're in the pipeline, but nothing that we have that is imminently waiting for approval in terms of tau. But that certainly, I think, is the hope going forwards, is that maybe at the start you're on this particular medication for this particular sort of physiological aspect, and then that maybe that switches to later in the disease. And I don't know if folks would have caught this in the media. It did receive a bit of media attention over the last few days around a blood test that researchers have developed that allows the to be able to test the levels of tau in someone's brain. And so obviously any blood-based biomarker is going to be much less invasive than doing a lumbar puncture to pull out the cerebral spinal fluid. And what we do know why a blood test like that would be helpful is that we know that these anti-amyloid therapies like lecanemab or like donanemab, which acts similarly to lecanemab, they're most effective for people who have lower levels of tau in their system. So once we have a blood test that allows us to look at what those levels of tau are, we're able to start to target the medications a little bit better.
Okay, lots more questions are popping up. Fabulous to see such an engaged audience. Thank you, everyone, and just confirming that we are keeping track of all the questions as well. So even if we don't have a chance to give it a like or confirm, Sarah and I both have our eyes on the chat. So another question for you, Heather: was there any evidence of differences in clinical trial outcomes for memantine or ACHEI based on participant ethnicity or race?
Um, so I think, and sorry, I should like go back to, I see the chat sort of has lit up with questions here, so I'd have to go back one. So if I'm understanding correctly, there hasn't been a head-to-head trial where we've compared lecanemab directly to the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, which is what the ACHEI stands for. So that's like donepezil. So we haven't had any clinical trial that's allowed those to go head to head. So we don't know how they would perform relative to one another. That perhaps is something that might be coming in the future. But again, we know that those acetylcholinesterase inhibitors reduce the amount of acetylcholine, which mask the symptoms and can help address the symptoms. So they're really a symptomatic treatment rather than addressing the actual progression of the disease. And I'm hoping that answers the question. If it's not, whoever asked that question, I encourage them to ask a clarifying question in the chat.
I'm wondering if I think there's some questions here that have just been submitted, might be in relation to what you're speaking to right now, Heather, so it might be worth addressing. One person asks, how does donepezil fit in? And another question, have these medications been tried on other dementias other than Alzheimer's?
Oh, two great questions. So the first one, so donepezil is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and acetylcholinesterase breaks down the acetylcholine. And if too much of that acetylcholine is broken down, that causes us to have some challenges in our brain. And so an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor stops the acetylcholinesterase from breaking down the acetylcholine. So donepezil is a type of acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. So that's the first question. And then, oh, I forgot the second one already, Sarah.
That's okay. Have these medications been tried on other dementias besides
Right.
Alzheimer's disease? Yeah.
Yes. So no. So because these drugs specifically target the amyloid plaques, or what they're really attacking are the precursors to the amyloid plaques, the material that forms, that sticky material that forms the plaques. Those are typically found in people with Alzheimer's disease. So the other dementias that may not have those amyloid plaques, this drug, this medication would not be effective for that and hasn't been tested for that. So, but there are other medications in the pipeline. And I think one of the things that is encouraging to me, every year there's a publication that comes out from a group of researchers in the US, And they map out in this lovely circle all of the drugs that are in the pipeline. And so a fair chunk of those are looking at amyloid, which is found in the brains of people who live with Alzheimer's disease. And we know that Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. So it makes sense in some ways that they're targeting that. But there are also other drugs that are coming down the pipeline, other avenues that, what is the role of neuroinflammation? What's the role of microglia, which are some of the other cells that are found in our brain? And so there's lots of work being done. It's just the brain is such a complex organ. So
Thanks for thanks for that, Heather. Switching gears a little bit, um, one of our attendees asks, um, why were Indigenous communities not included? I've noticed that there's less dementia amongst our elders, with a follow-up comment that I've never seen researchers talking to elders on reserves about dementia, even here in Vancouver or Canada. And I wanted to flip it over to I know Sarah had some ideas that jumped out in mind just to highlight some of the researchers who we know.
yeah, so
Yeah.
why don't let me answer the question around like why they weren't involved, and then I can, yes, Sarah, I think it would be great if you can share um sort of some answers to that. So I think it's a huge oversight. It's a huge oversight. We do know that the Indigenous folks of Indigenous heritage are also experience dementia. And we do know that going forwards, those rates are likely to increase by the time we hit 2050. There is potentially a dramatic increase there simply because of the number of folks who age. And we know that the number one risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease or related dementia is age. And none of us can really do anything about that, unfortunately. I think that one of the roles of the Alzheimer Society here is really to advocate for greater inclusion of people of diverse ethnic backgrounds in the research. So here in Canada, I'm trying to think where the clinical trial sites were for lecanemab. I'm not sure we had a lecanemab trial site in BC. I could be wrong. I know that we had a number of centers in Toronto that were testing lecanemab. I know that donanemab, a related drug, was tested in Kelowna here in the interior. But, again, small, like these are global studies. So what ends up happening is they pull a few people from each geographical area, but then together those make up the sort of what I think it was 1,800 people that were in that study trial. So I recognize that's actually not really a great answer. But I think it is something that we lobby for. And I think there is starting to be traction in the clinical trial community about the fact that they need to have greater representation and just to ensure that the research that is being conducted is more representative of the folks who may actually end up taking the medication when it comes to market.
Mm.
Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. That was such a great response. And um, I just wanted to note some key folks who are doing important work in this space. Professor Jennifer Walker is an associate professor at McMaster University and also a researcher who's affiliated with the Indigenous Research Institute in Ontario. Um, and our very own Katten Kelly. She is an SFU neuroscience master's student, and her work centers around brain health amongst Indigenous groups. So currently, she's doing work on improving access to culturally appropriate care for people living with dementia from Indigenous communities. So I also just wanted to flag that for folks.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, continuing in our vast list of questions. Um, so Heather, for you, if a Canadian goes to the US and pays for a PET scan for a quick process, would that be approved with a Canadian physician?
So like, would a Canadian physician make make a referral to have the PET scan in the US? um, I think is what's being asked. I think again, um, those scans and the CSF testing, that testing, that's not widespread testing that's done. So typically, we don't do the PET scans or the CSF testing at this point unless there's someone who is either has symptoms at a much younger age or they're a more complex case. And so it wouldn't be a primary care physician that would be ordering a PET scan or lumbar puncture. That would be a specialist that's ordering that. So you would have already had to have seen a specialist to do that. And there's a chance that, probably you could have that CSF test done here. And we do have actually Dr. Marie DeMarco, who's a BC researcher working out of St. Paul's. It's actually her lab that does all of the CSF testing for all of Canada currently, or for the majority of Canada here in BC. So I don't know there would be any benefit to going to the US to have that PET scan, because it would still you'd still need to have a referral from a specialist. So.
Thanks, Heather. We've got one for I hear references to early stage of dementia. Can you clarify what's meant as early?
Absolutely. So, so typically when we're looking at that disease trajectory, we're looking at the amount of amyloid plaque and the tau tangles that are in someone's brain. These drugs have only been tested on someone who has very mild symptoms. So they're still living independently. They're still able to conduct a lot of their day-to-day activities, but they're starting to notice more so, maybe there's a little bit of disorientation to time and place. Maybe you're not quite sure, like, what day was it again? Or maybe you're out driving and it's like all of a sudden, wow, which way is the way home? But outside of those pieces and oh, where am I at in the recipe that I'm making? We're talking about very mild symptoms of disease. So these drugs have only been tested with people that were just in those very beginning stages of the disease process. And that for folks who are much further along in the disease process, who maybe are no longer driving, are perhaps really struggling with, short-term memory, and their short-term memory just is nowhere near what it was, that these medications are not for them. Now, it doesn't mean that down the road we won't have medications that will be able to be targeted depending on where you are in the disease journey. And I think that's one of the beauties of the blood test that's just been developed, is that it allows us to stage people more accurately. It confirms, it's a biological confirmation of what that clinical diagnosis is looking like. And that will help us ensure that the right people are on the right meds at the right time.
Um, Thanks, Heather. And this might be a good transition for another for an upcoming webinar. But one of our attendees was asking, did you say we track the gene potentially through testing?
Yes, so the ApoE4 gene. So, and again, this is where we need to be careful in terms of how we talk about genetic susceptibility. And as Carrie said, we're delighted that our next Research Connects will actually be with a genetic counselor from UBC. He'll be able to speak to this in much more detail. But the ApoE4 is simply a susceptibility gene. So we don't do widespread testing of that because we don't want to alarm people. And also, just because you have an increased susceptibility to developing something doesn't mean that you're actually you're going to eventually go ahead and develop that disease. And so we need to be wary and mindful of that. There are genes that do increase the likelihood that someone will develop Alzheimer's disease. Those are the presenilin genes. That's typically found in the familial autosomal dominant type of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. But the majority of cases that we see are sporadic, meaning that they don't have that genetic link. So there isn't, there's no benefit to doing the genetic testing unless you are someone for whom your physician thinks, hey, lecanemab might be an ideal drug for you. And then, of course, we want to do that genetic testing because we want to make sure that you're not an ApoE4 carrier, or that if you are, then perhaps we'll step up the monitoring, right? It'll be flagged in the system that if you're an ApoE4 carrier and we know that there are potentially increased risks for you in terms of the ARIA, the edema, so the swelling or the bleeding, then you're going to be closely monitored. So that's a really key piece of information. And if you are going to be on an anti-amyloid therapy like lecanemab, then yes, that testing would absolutely be done before you started on the drug. And Marie DeMarco's lab at UBC is actually working on sort of getting all of those pieces into play when that time comes, and should that time come that lecanemab is approved in Canada.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heather. We have a suite of questions that are time related. So also noting that we're just coming up on 5 minutes left. We don't have much of an outro, but we will need a couple moments for our post-event survey. So thinking about time, is it recommended that the treatment duration last 5 years?
Now, I know I don't know. I see Bob's written that question. I don't know where the 5 years would have come from. Currently, we know that the clinical trials were for 18 months. We don't really know what happens after those 18 months are up. Should someone stay on this drug indefinitely? We don't know. We don't have that information. So one of the things that was contingent on lecanemab being approved in the US was the development of a registry system. So everyone that's on lecanemab in the US is being tracked, because what that does is that gives us real world data. And so the same thing, I suspect, would happen here in Canada. There would be a registry set up so that we can now start to look at what happens when you get to month 19 or 20 or 21. And so I think these are questions that we just at this point don't really have the answers for. So, again, you've heard me mention donanemab, which acts very similarly to lecanemab, but people came off donanemab early because it was so successful at removing the amyloid plaque from the brain. So again, lots more research needed before we sort of can conclusively say how long someone would stay on the drug for. And again, when we think about that $26,500 price tag, that obviously to stay on that for 5 years, and we need to make sure that it's still effective at the end of that 5 years. And currently, we're only looking at a delay of a couple of months. So what might that look like over a 5-year period? It's unclear.
Yeah, and a follow-up question about that $26,000 price tag. Can you confirm if that was in Canadian or US dollars?
That's US dollars. So yes, 26,500 US dollars. So it's unclear what that price point would be here in Canada. And I'm not sure what the price point is in the UK either. So for folks who are paying privately or have private coverage.
Okay, I know we're swiftly advancing to 3 p.m. Heather, I think you alluded to this in the potential access issues. But there's a question here. If someone's currently in the early stages of the disease right now, would they not necessarily qualify by the time the drug is approved?
And I think, yes, unfortunately, that could well be the case. Now, we don't know, right? Everyone's journey can look different. But given that we're still 18 months at least out from seeing this with being accessible for British Columbians, there is the potential that someone that's in the early stages today may not be eligible for the drug when it is finally approved. What it does speak to, though, is the importance of getting an early diagnosis. So again, these are, we often talk about this here at the Society, where if there are signs, or things aren't feeling quite right, it's like, don't dilly-dally about that diagnosis. There's still a lot of stigma around getting an early diagnosis, but as more of these medications start to come into to development and the pipeline and hopefully approved, it becomes ever so important that we have that diagnosis in those early stages where there's the potential for medications actually to do some real good.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in these very thoughtful and detailed questions.
Can I jump in? I see one more, Carrie, that I just,
Yes,
sorry,
please, Heather.
gosh, there's a lot in them here, but someone has asked, the medications are also prescribed for those with mild cognitive impairment caused by Alzheimer's, particularly due to genetic factors. Please help clarify, as this is commonly understood that MCI doesn't necessarily lead to dementia. So MCI doesn't always, so mild cognitive impairment doesn't always lead to dementia. And you can have mild cognitive impairment for a number of reasons, just like you can have dementia for a number of reasons. It could be due to vascular changes in the brain. It could be due to Alzheimer's disease. So MCI doesn't necessarily lead to dementia. But there is a proportion of individuals who, when diagnosed with MCI, will actually progress to developing full-blown Alzheimer's disease. And with that, I think probably that's it for questions. And I'll turn it back to you, Carrie. I think you've got some slides.
Yeah, and for any questions that we have not been able to cover in our session today, once I get my screen up and running, and maybe Sarah, you can throw in the chat. Um, Here
Our
we go.
yeah, our
So please feel welcome to reach out to our team for more information or specific questions to research at alzheimerbc.org. A huge thank you to Heather today for this really informative and interesting presentation. Thank you all for this engaged chat, really excellent questions, and for joining us today from near and far. We really hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and we always love to hear from you. So again, our email's in the chat, and we also, if I could advance my slide, we do have a survey, and we would love your feedback on this session. Um, if you're and I think Michael left the info for our First Link Dementia helpline, but if you're wanting more information about dementia or wondering about programs and services offered through the Society, please give our First Link Dementia helpline a call. Operators are available to support in a range of languages. And then we really appreciate hearing your feedback on how we can make these Research Connects webinars even better. So we have a survey set up specifically for this webinar series. It takes about 5 minutes, and giving that feedback is something that we so appreciate. The link is also in the chat. So please give it a click and submit after we sign off. We really hope, as Heather also mentioned, we hope that you'll join us on May 28th for our next Research Connects webinar, When Dementia Runs in the Family, Genetic Counseling, Genetic Testing, and Research Updates with Emily Dwash, who's a genetic counselor at the UBC Hospital Clinic for Alzheimer's Disease and Related Disorders, as she explains the role of genetics in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, the availability and implications of genetic testing for these conditions, and how genetic counselors support people and families affected by dementia. And The link to sign up for that will be available, as well as additional details at alzbc.org/webinars closer to the date. And please visit our YouTube channel to watch previous Research Connects webinar recordings. This webinar will also be available in the days following our session today. So again, thank you for a really engaged session. Um, and if you're interested in getting involved in research, please visit the I Want to Participate in Research tab on our research web pages. So that's alzbc.org/research, and click on the I Want to Participate in Research tab. And a QR code's also available. And with that, we'll sign off for today. Thank you again, everyone, for a really fantastic session.
Thanks, everyone. Take care now.